Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. We have heard that word so much this past months it's ricocheted around alongside threats, due dates, and exceptions. It's been tense, tiring, sometimes terrifying. The tariffs we've been hearing about are taxes on goods paid for by the importer once a product from abroad is brought, in this case, into the United States. Tariffs have been one of President Trump's main priorities. He has painted this as key to his America First agenda.
Tariffs are easy, they're fast, they're efficient.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary today is the word tariff. This country can become rich.
Hi, this is Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online. Today, we are trying to break through the noise and get right to the heart of the matter on what's going on when it comes to the Trump administration and tariffs. What do they mean for Latin American countries? Is this a shift in trade policy worldwide? In early March, the U.S. applied 25% tariffs on some goods coming from Canada and Mexico, the U.S.'s biggest trade partner. And on April 2nd, we also expect the U.S. government to announce global reciprocal tariffs.
Nicer than that. We've been very nice to a lot of countries for a long time, but I call it Liberation Day. April 2nd is Liberation Day.
The turnarounds have been so many, no one really knows how future announcements will take shape. Trump has threatened tariffs on other specific goods, like copper and lumber, and just this week on countries that import oil from Venezuela. As I record this, the president is announcing another 25% this time on imported cars to hit the auto sector on April 2nd as well.
There's a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. We start off with.
Some other levies affecting the region are already in place. On March 12, 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel went into effect, hitting Canada, but also countries like Brazil and Argentina.
It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all.
Almost all economists believe this will have, at least in the short term, negative economic effects. So why then would Trump do it?
I think in an era when the United States is revisiting tariff levels with our North American trading partners, it's safe to say that you have to consider that all the cards are on the table, right?
That's Kellie Meiman Hock. She's a trade expert in Washington and a senior counselor at McLarty Associates. Meiman Hock spoke with my colleague Gladys Gerbeau about the motivators behind the U.S. shift in trade policy and how these tariffs could change commercial ties in the region.
So I think that diversification effort will continue. Where that can get tricky vis-a-vis the United States is that there already was quite a bit of trade diversification away from the United States happening in Latin America, but with China, which, as I said before, is politically very, very complicated.
Thank you for joining us. It is impossible to cover all trade agreements the U.S. has with Latin America in one episode, but we keep following the Trump administration policies affecting the region. If you want to learn more, take a look at other episodes from this year, check our website, as-coa.org, or subscribe to ASCOA newsletters to stay in the loop.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Kellie, thank you for coming to the Latin America in Focus podcast.
Thank you for having me, Gladys.
In the first 2 months of President Trump's second term, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of action surrounding tariffs. Why is trade such a high priority for this administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's very important to remember that of all the topics that are a priority for President Trump, there are two that really go way back into the 80s for him. One of them is immigration, and the other one is tariffs. It's something he's cared deeply about since then. And I think that what you're seeing right now is a trade policy that is just motivated by very different drivers than we have seen recently. And I thought I might just tick through for your audience, Gladys, what some of those main drivers really are. First and foremost, this is something that for a Latin American audience that is used to the history of ISI, import substitution, industrialization, this won't be unique, but that's to protect industry. So when you look at the revival of the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, that's really focused on protecting and incenting additional investment and jobs and growth in the U.S. steel and aluminum industries.
Today, I'm simplifying our tariffs on steel and aluminum so that everyone can understand exactly what it means. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions.
Something that's relatively new is to use tariffs as a source of revenue. If you followed at all the discussions around the budget here in the United States, we're seeing that tariffs are being talked about as a pay-for, which is something we haven't seen in over 100 years in our history. Thirdly, I would flag reciprocity. This idea that if we are paying a tariff of X on a good from a country, that they should be paying that same tariff. It should be equivalent, right? So that's the idea of reciprocity.
You know, they send in a bicycle and we send them a bicycle. They charge us 100 and 200. India charges a lot. Brazil charges a lot. If they want to charge us, that's fine, but we're going to charge them the same thing.
Which sounds really good in theory, but it can be really complicated in the implementation, and we can talk more about that later. Fourthly, it's addressing trade deficits. So that's something that every country needs to be sensitive to. Do I have a trade deficit with the United States, and does that put a target on my head? And then also leverage, and we've seen that in the Mexico and the Canada examples, right? Trying to use tariffs as leverage on non-trade related items such as fentanyl or migration.
The drugs continue to pour into our country, killing hundreds of thousands of people. We're losing substantially more than 100,000 people. I mean, dead. They're dead.
And from a Canadian perspective, I think that that has gone far enough that they're feeling like part of the objective around the tariffs is to disrupt the status quo and to consolidate power.
It would be a great state. It would be a cherished state.
So there's definitely some sovereignty concerns there from their perspective. And finally, Gladys, China is a big motivator. There's a lot of concern in both Democratic and Republican circles in Washington about the national security and economic security risks that China poses to the United States. So that's also a huge motivator.
You mentioned these different drivers that Trump has had since the 80s. And we know that during his first term, he also leveraged tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. So I'm wondering, how is this time similar or different from his previous term?
There's quite a few differences. And you're right. I mean, the steel and aluminum tariffs that I referenced before, it's really a revival of a 232 national security case that was filed in the first Trump administration. Really, all that they did was to revisit that and remove some of the exemptions that were previously provided. So that activity in the national security trade realm is certainly very consistent. You have the continuation during the Biden administration, of course, of the 301 tariffs on China. And so that's incredibly consistent. I think where we see a real big break in trade policy with this Trump administration 2.0 versus 1.0 is the use of IEEPA, the International Emergency Economics Powers Act of 1977. So this is an act that historically has been used more on the sanctions side. It's never been used on the tariff side. But you see the tariffs that have been applied thus far against Mexico, Canada, and China have had emergency reasons behind the justifications for the applications of that tariff linked to fentanyl. And so that's true for all three of those countries. And so that is something that many trade lawyers are questioning. There have been no legal actions against the use of IEEPA in those three cases to date. My sense is, talking to trade lawyers around town, that there is a desire to wait until April 2nd when we see what happens on the reciprocity tariffs and how these IEEPA tariffs are impacted by that, if at all. But if there were one main thing, Gladys, that I would highlight that really differentiates this trade policy versus Trump 1.0, it's that leaning on IEEPA. It's that really leaning in on using tariffs as leverage for non-trade items.
I want to ask you about some of the specific tariffs President Trump has imposed. Tariffs on Mexico and Canada went into effect, then were delayed until April 2nd. That's basically a week from today. Mexico is the U.S.'s largest trade partner globally, which sets it apart from the rest of the region. What can these tariffs mean for the Mexican economy?
It means everything for Mexico, right? Because 80% of Mexican exports go to the United States. It's about 73% for Canada. So it's equally important for Canada. The bottom line is for North American trade, all three of our countries have been relying on these trade agreements, be it NAFTA or the reformed USMCA, for over 30 years. And that means that our companies have become incredibly intertwined and really have treated goods that are coming from Mexico as equal to goods that are coming from Canada or from the United States. That has accrued to all three of our countries' benefit when it comes to diversification away from China, away from Asia, trying to make North American manufacturing more competitive. There have been downsides that we did not manage well. Also, I would highlight as far as job displacement, which is part of why we see some of the discontent around trade policy in the United States today. But it's important to highlight that this idea of having a North American trade bloc, the origin of it really, really was to help us to better compete. And so the impact, should we step back from our USMCA commitments, would be very intense. I think the facts that you saw the administration initially say that there would be 25% IEEPA tariffs against Mexico and Canada, the fact that they then ratcheted that down to products that are not complying with the regional value content provisions that basically don't have the rules of origin to comply under USMCA, just that alone, I think, is a recognition of how important our integrated trade is, and frankly, how hard companies that are investing in North America have worked to try to meet those regional value contents. Now, in some cases, because U.S. tariffs are at zero, in some cases, companies weren't even doing the paperwork to show that they were meeting the rules of origin. That's changing now with these new tariffs. Folks are trying to figure out what the right path is. But I think of all of the trade actions that are being contemplated by the administration and actions that have been taken by the administration, North America trade is really the one that's the most impactful.
You talked about a certain discontent caused by previous trade policies. Would you say this is exclusively American, or do these new trade policies tell us something larger about the global mood of free trade?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an inflection point. I think right now the United States is the one that's kind of leading the charge as far as skepticism with respect to the global trading order. And this is a trading order that, to be clear, the United States was really the driver behind post-World War II, believing that if we created rules of the road that would allow a decimated Europe, a decimated Japan to rebuild, that would allow the developing world to grow their middle classes and to participate more fully in the global economy, that would be something that would benefit U.S. companies, U.S. workers, because it would give us markets to sell into. So that was really the theory, right? And I think it's important to remember that, because it's so easy to just say, oh, trade is bad, globalization is bad, this was a huge mistake. I think we should remember what the origin story is, right? Now, that said, I think that the fact that we did not do a good enough job, at least in the United States, to really accommodate workers through a transition that had to do with technology as much as it had to do with trade. I mean, honestly, we could have never done one free trade agreement. We could have never let China into the World Trade Organization. And because of cell phones, IT, ideas would have gone everywhere. Because of containerized shipping becoming more prevalent and cheaper, goods would go everywhere. So it's really those two dynamics, shipping and the IT revolution, that I think we would have ended up with some of the same challenges, even if we hadn't done trade agreements. That said, we did do trade agreements. We really were trying to make our hemisphere more competitive. We have more free trade agreements with Latin American countries than we do any other region of the world. And so making sure that we are addressing some of those, at the end of the day, which are domestic concerns, I think they are shared by other countries. I think because with the advent of cutting edge technologies, new technologies like AI and such, is hard for communities that have been used to other economic models, manufacturing, et cetera, not to be a bit thrown off or concerned about that and the impacts it will have on their community. And we've seen the impact that it's had on many U.S. communities. So I think managing that better going forward is very, very key for us, at least in our domestic politics here in the United States.
We talk a lot, for obvious reasons, about Mexico and USMCA, but the U.S., as you said, has free trade agreements in effect with a total of 11 Latin American countries. Could you talk a bit about these other countries in the region, besides Mexico, that have close trade relations with the U.S.?
For the countries that already have free trade agreements, I think in an era when the United States is revisiting tariff levels with our North American trading partners, it's safe to say that you have to consider that all the cards are on the table, right? But it is possible that the United States would try to revisit some of its tariff commitments. So one of our longest standing free trade trading partners in South America is Chile, right? So thinking about, can I depend on those tariff rates sticking? In the case of DR-CAFTA, that's one where the special advisor to the president on Latin America, Mauricio Claver-Carron, he wrote, it might have even been in America's Quarterly, I think it was in one of your publications last fall, that revisiting CAFTA would be important. I think the fact that Nicaragua is clearly not a democratic country right now really rankles here in Washington. And the fact is, in the agreement, there's no mechanism for expelling a country for non-democratic behavior, but managing that is a challenge. And it's something that folks talk about as far as how to manage that situation. So I would say that all of the trade agreements that exist in the hemisphere could potentially be in play. The good news is, because most of them have been around for so long, that we are in many/most products, and we all have little parts of our economy that we protect. And I know folks talk about Canada Dairy. We've got our sugar program in the United States. There's things that even in a free trade agreement tend to get fenced off. However, for most of the goods, for the countries that we do have free trade agreements with in the hemisphere, the Colombias, the Perus, we're already at zero for a lot of those goods. So in a reciprocity environment, I would hope that the fact that we have these free trade agreements and the fact that we are applying equivalent tariffs one on the other should be helpful. I think where the reciprocity conversation might get a bit more complicated is Brazil, right? So Brazil ethanol tariffs was actually included. It was the first bullet point in the reciprocity executive order that the president put out back on February 13th. I think it's interesting to highlight that February 13th was the same day that India's Modi came to the White House. And India, like Brazil, is one of those countries that is often talked about in Washington as having some tariff peaks, which obviously are not very popular under this administration. And I thought it was interesting that Modi came to the White House with a tariff offer in hand of unilaterally reducing some of his tariffs. I think that this, because not every country in the hemisphere has a free trade agreement with us, it's a dual question, right? What happens to those countries that do have free trade agreements with us? How sticky will those trade commitments be in an environment where the Trump administration is reevaluating its commitment to previously made trade commitments, tariff commitments? And then for those countries, such as those of Mercosur, et cetera, that don't have free trade agreements with us, what are their vulnerabilities or opportunities as the United States continues down this path? One item that I think is interesting is including, because we have so many free trade agreements with countries in the hemisphere, the United States actually has a trade surplus, or we are more or less even with many of the countries in the hemisphere. So given that one of those key motivators of Trump's trade policy is addressing trade deficits, actually, when we're looking at hemispheric trade, that's a point where for most countries, obviously not Mexico, obviously not Canada, that's at least in part why we're going through what we're going through with USMCA right now, but that should be something that actually protects. We'll see what comes out next week, but that should be something that's a bit protective when it comes to the trade relationships in the hemisphere.
You mentioned Brazil, and I was going to ask you specifically, President Trump's latest tariffs on steel and aluminum obviously impact Canada and Mexico, but they also impact Brazil and Argentina. And it has been approximately 2 weeks since those went into effect. So how have those countries been responding, and are they in a different situation than Mexico or Canada?
I think they are, and they certainly were in Trump 1.0. The way that the exemptions were negotiated was very different because Canada and Mexico addressed that in the context of the NAFTA renegotiation. And I think what you're seeing now is both Brazil and Argentina independently, right, on a bilateral basis, working with the U.S. government to see if exemptions, to see if quotas might be possible as it was previously. So I think in the case of Brazil, the Vice President Alckmin has been very engaged in this.
O Brasil não é problema para os Estados Unidos.
He obviously coming from the business community and having that street cred, if you will, with the Brazilian business community, I think he's the perfect interlocutor with the U.S. government to see what might be possible.
No caso do Brasil, Estados Unidos tem superávit.
I think also you're seeing the private sector organizations, the CNIs, Confederação Nacional de Indústria, as well as AmCham being engaged in that. For the Argentine case, I think they're also hopeful. Obviously, President Milei and President Trump do have a privileged relationship.
Make Argentina great again. Viva la libertad, carajo!
They have spent quite a bit of time together. So I think that there are hopes that that might be helpful to reach some sort of a carve out or an accord, and the extent to which Milei has even said he'd be willing to do some sort of a free trade agreement with the United States, if that would help to resolve it. I don't see a huge appetite in Washington, frankly, in the Trump administration or outside the Trump administration, just by anyone to do free trade agreements right now. Maybe a limited one on critical minerals or something that's a bit more ring fenced. But I think that there is a hope that there will be a possibility to do some kind of a carve out. Now, that said, the Trump administration and frankly, President Trump himself has said that he's not terribly open to exemptions. So we'll see how that evolves, if that evolves. And I think a lot of this is going to play out in the coming weeks.
We've mentioned April 2nd a few times throughout our conversation, which is the date in which these reciprocal tariffs are expected to go into effect. Could you briefly explain how these work, which countries in the region will feel the biggest impact, and how they might respond?
Well, the fast question is we don't know yet how they're going to work. If reporting is to be believed, and there have been a number of journalists that have done some good reporting in this space, there have been a number of different methodologies that have been examined and considered, looking at average tariff rates, looking at tariff peaks on specific items. The administration has stated that there are 15 countries that they're specifically focused on. They call them the Dirty 15. Their words, not mine, but China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, India, South Korea, the EU, Brazil, Russia, Australia, Ireland. There's a list of countries where they're very clearly focused, some of which were mentioned in the White House press release, others of which were not. But it's very clear that, at least with respect to that bucket of countries, that they are planning to take pretty strong action. I think my understanding is that the president would like for reciprocal tariffs to be as broad as possible. But the reality is, when our HTS codes have 99 chapters, I mean, imagine how many numbers that is and how many countries. And just even thinking of the Excel spreadsheet makes my head hurt. And in talking to friends who are more technical in the customs space, it kind of boggles the mind as far as how you would actually implement that. So I think that's what they're bumping up against, and why what you will see next week will, in my opinion, most likely be incredibly broad, but probably won't be fully down to the last tariff line reciprocal. That would just be too difficult to implement.
My final question for you: what do you expect from now on? How do you see the trade relationships in the region shaping up against this backdrop? And this could be between countries, with the US, with other players. How do you see these relationships evolving?
I mean, I think we need to be ready for anything, right? I think that the tone and the substance of the announcements for the April 2 tariffs will be important as far as how the region is positioning itself. How USMCA is treated in that context will also be, I think, very important. What's clear to me is that countries are taking extremely seriously right now the need to diversify their trade relationships, right? I've often joked on, for example, the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, that maybe my grandkids would see that come into force. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that at this point, Mercosur and the EU in this context might be thinking, okay, this is something that maybe the French farmers are worried about, those Brazilian and Argentine ag exports, and maybe auto manufacturers in Brazil and Argentina are a little bit worried about those German cars, but it's worth taking the risk, right? And it's worth jumping into that pool and making sure that both parties have other options. The Canadian ambassador here in Washington has been very direct about the fact that Canada is actively trying to diversify its trade flows given the current status of trade relations in the United States. So I think that diversification effort will continue. Where that can get tricky vis-a-vis the United States is that there already was quite a bit of trade diversification away from the United States happening in Latin America, but with China, which, as I said before, is politically very complicated. The trade aspect, Chinese inbound investment aspect, those dynamics complicate. And as I said at the top, China's one of the motivators of this trade policy, right? So at the end of the day, that's something that needs to be watched. And another idea that's been bandied about by the administration is the idea of tariffing items that go through Chinese ports. And we know in Latin America, it depends on how you define a Chinese port. Are we talking capital or ownership? There's a lot of different details that you would need to work out. But that's something that's been discussed. And so, I think kind of keeping that in mind and just surprises. I mean, we're taping this on Tuesday, just yesterday, last night, Monday, we saw the new proposal with respect to tariffing countries that are buying Venezuelan oil, which ironically shouldn't impact countries in the region as much as China, India, Spain, and some others, as I understand it. But we kind of need to be ready for anything in this trade environment. And so it's incredibly dynamic. And I think it does work to the region's benefit that so many of the countries have free trade agreements, but everybody's going to have to stay on their toes.
Kellie, thank you so much for joining us.
I enjoyed it. You're doing a great job with the podcast.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Lemy. This episode was produced by Gladys Gerbeau, Kalia Robertson, and Fabricio Ricalde. I'm the executive producer for the show. You can read more about this Trump administration in Latin America on our website, www.as-coa.org/Trump. We've been tracking the new government policies on trade, migration, and more, and we also included a link to the America's Quarterly article by Marcelo Claver Caron that Kellie Meiman Hock mentioned during this interview. The music in this podcast is by Eloisa Fernandez Quartet, performing for America's Society here in New York City. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. And consider becoming a member of America's Society. We're going to leave you a link on the notes. If you listen up to here, check out other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast. Share this episode and the show with other Latin America aficionados, and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America's Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.